Welcome to Everything Ethics Weekly Talk Show with Kevin Foster. And today, my special guest is Robert Zafft. Robert is the author of The Right Way to Win, an approach that builds on his 30 years real world experience in global business, consultant, law, and expert advisory work. Robert has designed and led leadership development related training across North America, Asia, and Europe. His participants have comprised executives ranging from cabinet ministers and public company C-suite leaders to mid-career executives to professional MBA students. Robert is a Harvard Law School graduate and formerly held senior positions with McKinsey and Company, Tony Blair Associates, OECD. He was recently named Forbes Leadership Strategy Contributor for Business Ethics, Compliance, and Governance. What a resume Robert has today. And Robert, thank you very, very much for participating in our talk show. And I'll let you go ahead and give yourself a little more of a plug if you wanted to amplify anything I just said.
Well, I think my mother would be very pleased with that introduction. So let me thank you for that, Kevin. The book is called The Right Way to Win, Making Business Ethics Work in the Real World. And so my approach, I teach, but I'm not an academic. I have 30 years of business experience. And so I'm very much focused on practical applications to help companies run better, because my theory is that the same tools and techniques that drive business success also drive ethical behavior. It's not a trade-off.
Well, I think that is so right. I think you're right on that. So that's great. So anyway, I'd like to kind of get into a little bit about some of your background in overseas and even here in the U.S. with developing ethics programs and your approach to developing an ethical culture.
Okay, well, if I were going to sum up my career, I would say that man plans and God laughs. So I've done a range of things. I've practiced law. I've been a McKinsey consultant. I've been on the business side. I've been an international expert with the OECD. So those are just the breadth of experiences I have. And working with companies and real clients in that space and trying to read as deeply as I could in the area, you really come to the conclusion, obviously, that culture is prime, that's what really ultimately drives ethics, is what's the culture of the organization or the group you're talking about. As Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so that is, I think, not just that is the challenge of ethics, and it really starts at the C-suite. It has to be driven by the only chief ethics officer a company really has is the chief executive officer, because that person sets the tone, that person drives the culture, and that ultimately decides how people are going to behave.
Yeah, I think that is very, very true. So how would you define an ethical culture? What would be your definition of an ethical culture?
Well, the key to ethics is alignment of the individual's interests with that of the end goals of the organization. And so you think about Maslow's hierarchy of need. He was a psychologist writing in the middle of the last century. He talked about our first concern is shelter, food, warmth, water, et cetera. Then we move on to things like self-esteem, the accolades of others, and then ultimately to self-actualization. And so I think that the successful business cultures are the ones that are based on what you would call virtue ethics, which is people want to be motivated by a better image of themselves. They want to achieve self-actualization. And so if a culture is one in which people are called to a higher vision of themselves, they will act in that way. As Steve Wynn said, money doesn't touch it. Steve Wynn's view is that once people are being paid fairly, that their motivations really turn to psychological factors. And so what you would see in virtue ethics, as opposed to cost benefit, for example, or other forms of ethical outlook, in virtue ethics, people are driven to do something because they feel better about themselves for doing it. And you can compare, for example, the Marines. They don't, when they want to recruit people, they don't say to young people, come take a low-paying job that might get you killed. All right, that's a bad cost benefit plug, if there ever was one. Right?
Exactly.
What the Marines are saying is the few, the proud, the Marines. And the Marines are looking for a few good men. And what they're really saying is come join the elite of the excellent. And so what you find in successful business cultures, in my view, ones that are ethical, is that they're going to be able to align the end goals of the organization with the self-esteem of the individual employee. And if you'd like, we can go through some examples I talk about in my book.
I like the example of Steve Wynn and what he does, because it seems like to me that's just like a win-win for everyone. It's a win-win for the organization. It's a win-win for the shareholders, win-win for the customers, and for the employees. And I really like that example. And so I'm going to let you elaborate on that.
Okay, so Steve Wynn at one point was called the King of Las Vegas. He came to Vegas in his late 20s. He was able to parlay a real estate holding into a controlling interest in the casino, and he really transformed Vegas from gambling into gaming, which means a large part of what he's trying to deliver is a 5 or 6 star recreational experience, which includes the casino operations, but also includes the shows, the restaurants, the fabulous buildings, etc. And his challenge is he has thousands and thousands of employees, and he's trying to deliver a top-notch deluxe experience for very demanding high-end customers with thousands of employees who aren't necessarily very well paid. They're not necessarily highly educated, and they have direct touch points with these very demanding consumers. And so what he says is his problem at the top of the organization is that basically he doesn't know what's going on. And how did he solve that dilemma? And his answer was culture, very clearly culture. And so what he did is he developed a culture of storytelling. So at the beginning of every shift, every supervisor who has at least 3 direct reports gets together and they ask if anybody has a story of great customer service from the day before. And if somebody comes forward, and anybody can nominate themselves, it's not like the employee of the month that gets picked by management. Anyone can nominate him or herself. They tell the story. They get the accolades of the group. If it's a particularly good story, it gets reported into the internal communications function. So for certain stellar stories, they bring in a communications team. They videotape the employee in question. They put the woman or the man's picture up on the internal dining hall, and they make that person a hero. And the cumulative effect of this is that what Wynn says is he now has 12,000 employees walking the halls of his organization looking for a customer they can serve, looking for a guest with a problem. And he says that the power of making people feel good about themselves in terms of serving the customer makes him sleep good at night, because he, as the CEO, is driving the culture, but the employees are driving the experience.
And that experience drives consumer happiness too.
Exactly. They're getting the high touch treatment they want and they demand, and they're willing to pay quite a premium for. But the thing to bear in mind, of course, is that Wynn's approach was situated in the nature of his business and his industry. And so what I would say to anybody who's watching this is beware consultants bearing PowerPoint who have these universal frameworks for culture building, because it depends on the personality and so to speak, the genius of the CEO. It depends on the business you're in. It depends on the industry. It depends on how you're situated, what kind of people you're trying to motivate. So I think you're right to ground things in virtue ethics, but how you do that is very particular to the organization.
Do you have another example where another company successfully implemented a virtue ethics approach?
Well, there's one which is government, which people tend not to think of as necessarily highly motivated. So when Hyman Rickover was an admiral building the nuclear navy back in the late 40s and early 50s, he really had to start from scratch. He had to hire first tens of people to build his core team, then hundreds of researchers and technologists, and ultimately thousands and tens of thousands of servicemen, servicewomen, and vendors who had to be trained to perform at unprecedented levels of quality. And so what he built was a culture that was based on personal growth through professional attainment. So he was bringing people in, he was giving them lots of experience early, he was expecting people to engage in self-study, constant self-improvement, and he wanted people who were motivated by challenge. And so what he was doing was he was not taking people who were already superstars. And some of these people were just average sailors. but he was motivating them to a higher vision of themselves and giving them the environment in which they could pursue that. There's one great quote of a chief petty officer who says he can't believe that he wasted 15 years of his life because nobody kicked his ass. But now he's in this program, he's working harder than he's ever worked before, but he's actually a thinking human being. And that simple fact that he's in an organization that's calling him to his best is highly motivating. It's also highly motivating at the senior levels. So here again, different situation, different challenge. Rickover had to build an organization. He had to innovate with the research and the engineering. He had to build to extraordinary levels of precision that people hadn't had to deal with before. And then he had to operate what could be extraordinarily dangerous pieces of equipment with considerable discipline and operational expertise. And the nuclear Navy has sailed 162 million miles without a mishap. So that's an extraordinarily high functioning organization built on virtue ethics.
Yeah. And do you have some examples where there's been cultural failures that you think that the culture went the wrong way because the CEO did not manage it in the right way? I mean, I could think of a half a dozen or more just off the top of my head. I'm sure you know as well. So that you have some favorite examples, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's fun to beat up people when they're down, I know. I think a good one to talk about, I think, is Arthur Andersen. I know it's already 20 years old, but it's a classic in the business literature. But what makes it more interesting to me is Arthur Andersen had so many things going right for it, and yet it sank overnight like the Titanic hitting an iceberg. And when I say things going right, the company was a global unified partnership. What that meant was the managers of the company were also the people who owned it. And they had incredible sweat equity in the firm. So I know some of these people, they slaved away for 10, 15 years to make it to the top of the organization. And they didn't want to risk that huge investment of their lives. In addition, Arthur Andersen, they were an audit firm. They were the world's premier audit and tax accounting firm. So these were the smartest guys in the world in process controls, in audit, right? In all the kind of risk management things that you think you'd want to have in place to make sure your company doesn't sink. They had all those things going for it, and yet they failed. And what's really interesting in terms of how they failed, and I take a different view slightly on what's going on. I don't think that suddenly everybody became greedy. I think what happened was people were desperately trying to do the right thing in that organization, but they lost sight of the line. What Warren Buffett says is, make your money in the middle of the court. If something is close to the line, just let it go. And so what happened at Arthur Andersen is you had all these highly motivated, extraordinarily competent people who were making a lot of money, and they wanted to continue to make a lot of money. And the way you make a lot of money is you keep your clients happy in that business. And they had to compete extremely viciously with other accounting firms that were out there for their lunch. Right, that was the environment they were in. And what happened over time in that organization was people lost sight of the line in two ways, I think. One is they confused serving the client executives who hired them with serving the client entity, which was formerly their client, as well as the public interest, because certified public accountants, or chartered accountants as they're called in other places, have a duty not just to their clients, but to the public good. Right. And I think what happened was they were so focused on pleasing the client executives that they lost sight of serving the overall client. That was one issue. Another issue, particularly in North America, was the move in accounting from standards-based accounting to bright line rules. So when you have a standard is something that's a little bit squishy and requires some professional judgment to determine. So for example, the accounting statement would say that it fairly represents in all material respects the financial condition of the company. Well, fair is a standard, material is a standard, and these things are kind of squishy. And what was happening was the trial lawyers were suing the accountants and their clients whenever there was an economic problem with a company, and a decision had to be made in a gray area over what was fair or what was material. And so the accountants ended up convincing the regulators and others with the clients to say, well, let's have some bright line rules as safe harbors. And what happens is once you have the safe harbor, people are no longer saying generally what's fair. They're just trying to meet the form of the safe harbor rather than the substance of what the safe harbor is supposed to do. And so ultimately, the leadership of Arthur Andersen lost sight of what it was supposed to be doing in the eyes of its founding principles. Not again, because people said today, I'm going to be greedy, but because they were so desperate to serve the client that they ended up serving the wrong person in the wrong way. And they cratered their firm. And part of the reason they cratered their firm also was just the arrogance of top management, which assumed that the government would never kill Arthur Andersen. And when Arthur Andersen had its problems and refused to make an example of its leadership and its Enron-related partners, the government said, okay, if you won't make an example of yourself, we will. And the government crushed Arthur Andersen. By indicting Andersen, Andersen could no longer audit publicly traded clients. It was the end of the firm. All right. That's 90,000 professionals, over $9 billion a year revenue. Gone.
Yeah.
That's a failure.
The government's taking more of a different approach to that these days. They're looking for individual executives in order to blame and to prosecute, as opposed to the company itself, though it has gone after the company itself. But to your point, that if a company thinks it's just going to pay a fine and move on, it's not a very solid business plan, because eventually people are going to be tired of you having to pay fines. You're not a very good, corporate citizen at that point in time. If you're just going to keep on going up to that line and cross it occasionally and pay the fines as they come, it's not a very good long range plan, especially if everyone's now trying to concentrate on all the ESG issues, the governance issues. Become a huge point these days. Mm-hmm. So the point that when you're creating your corporate culture is to be able to create one that provides a good long-term business model, just not for short-term gains.
Well, reputational risk is very lumpy. Okay, it's like a hurricane. You don't. There might be a 20% chance you're going to get a hurricane this year in Florida, but you don't get 20% of a hurricane. You either get one or you don't.
Right.
And so what people mistake about reputational risk is they assume that they can somehow bear the brunt of it and ride it out and spread the risk out over time. That's what Arthur Andersen hoped to do, because they said to the government, we'll pay $750 million as a fine, but we're going to pay it over 5 years. And the government said, no, that's not going to work. And so when people are gambling with reputation, what they sometimes don't realize, or they fool themselves into thinking, is that they'll be able to ride out a problem and kind of spread the risk and the cost over time. And that doesn't work if the problem kills you. Now, there's one issue when the people at the top of the organization are crooked, but there's also something that happens in every organization. And that is, typically the people at the top of the organization understand the value of the overall reputation, and they want to preserve it. So the people at the top tend to be more risk averse because they've already made it and they want to protect what they have. Think about these Arthur Andersen partners. They slaved for 10 or 15 years. They became equity partners. They had the prospect of making millions of dollars a year every year until they retired. So they shouldn't have wanted to run crazy risks. But in other organizations, what happens is the people lower down haven't made their careers, haven't made their money, and they want to take more risk because they want the bonus, they want the promotion, they want the salary bump. And if what they're gambling with is the reputation of the house, that becomes extremely dangerous to the house. Because if I have a whole bunch of mid and lower level people running around risking my reputation, eventually it's going to bankrupt me. It's just a bad bet.
Right. Absolutely. And it seems like the big tech companies are almost an exception to that rule in the sense that a lot of those leaders really don't care about it as much. I think they've gotten so arrogant. Mark Zuckerberg had his texts become public as from a civil lawsuit that he was involved in. And essentially, he was downplaying the whole role of ethics in an organization. It's like, who needs ethics? We don't need ethics. As long as we're not doing anything illegal, we don't need ethics. But, who's a big repeat offender over there of government regulations? It's Facebook. And Facebook was given a $5 billion fine for being a repeat offender. So it hurt itself hugely in the pocketbook based on that, and also reputationally. And I think, Google and Twitter, those are other companies that have taken hits lately. And I'm not sure how much they really care about their reputation if they're the only game in town. So there's a bit of arrogance that goes on there.
Well, this part of this question you raised earlier about how is the government looking at companies now? And the government has come out with updated guidance from the Department of Justice Criminal Division on evaluation of corporate compliance programs. And the government has basically said, look, we're going to put our cards on the table. If you try to do in good faith what we're asking you to do and a problem arises, we're going to go easy on the entity. We might slam the individuals involved, but we sense that we have an organization that's trying to do the right thing. At the same time, what's not said is the flip side, which is if you don't do what we're asking you to do and a problem arises, we're going to come after you as hard as we possibly can. Part of that is going to be coming after the senior most executives. And bear in mind that there is a lot of criminal liability under Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, about financial controls. Mm-hmm. You also now have the California privacy laws. So when you look back at an Arthur Andersen, which was paying fines pretty regularly, but never admitting wrongdoing, you would say, well, it was inevitable that they'd finally hit something that would sink them. But if you viewed it at the time, the people running that organization might have said, well, hey, we've just hit 4 icebergs in a row. We've paid some fines, which aren't much compared to the money we're making. It's a cost of doing business, full speed ahead. So in a sense, organizationally and in terms of the people at the top, if their attitude really is compliance is only for the little people, I think it's only a matter of time till they hit something that sinks them personally or sinks the business.
Well, I think that's exactly true. And as you and I have discussed before, that the executives have an obligation to know what's going on in the business. So there's legal liability if you had the ability to know, but you ignored it, if you were blind to it, you chose to do that. And so if you had the data and you're not analyzing the data, then it becomes a huge problem. You know, all of the opioid lawsuits have been out there lately, or just for that reason, where the companies were selling tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of pills to the same people over and over again, and not even asking why do these people have a market this big? Well, the only reason why they had a market that big was because people were abusing those pills, and they were selling the pills to people who were selling them who shouldn't be buying them to begin with. And so you get companies like Purdue, they get totally slammed, as well as McKesson and some of the others. And this is prime examples where the executives had the data, they should have known, but they didn't take the opportunity to know. And therefore, their business totally ran out and did great harm to the companies and to society as well.
I don't want to get too much into politics. You mentioned Facebook, and there's some kind of interesting things that happen around donations to candidates, donations to certain public causes that might favor certain candidates or parties over others. So there's a game that's played at a very high level that is, I'd say, out of scope for this particular discussion, but it's a very interesting one for people to have, and I think they should as informed citizens. The government's quandary is they recognize at some point that if a company as an organization has been trying to do the right thing, it's really not fair to slam the company and its shareholders for tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in fines if it really was the action of some rogue actors. And the government's asking themselves, well, what do we look for to make that determination? And that's where the guidance comes in. And some of it makes sense where they're talking about, you know, a corporate culture, communications, training, the things you would expect to see. Some stuff that the government looks for is a little bit odd outside the context of a bureaucracy, such as what's your turnover rate in your compliance function? Mm-hmm. Do your compliance people make as much as other people in the company? All right. That's a great question in a federal bureaucracy, and it makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense in the private sector. So I think in this particular case, the government, the U.S. sentencing guidelines say that senior managers shall, not may or should, shall establish effective ethics and compliance programs. And that's where a lot of the movement right now is to say, well, how do we map what the government is expecting against what we currently have and against what we could have with a certain amount of budget and a certain amount of time. So one area I advise clients is this mapping effort, saying, okay, what's the gap to what you currently have? What would your aspiration be? What's the budget and the time you would need to close that particular gap? And at the end of the day, is it something you really want to do? Because some of what the government is asking for might not make the most sense from a business standpoint. So you have to think about that. The other reality is, if a problem happens, the people who are going to come in initially are probably going to be a lead investigator in mid to late 20s with absolutely no business experience. And yet they're coming in to look at your control systems. And what's interesting again is in the guidance, if you do a word search, you'll see the word effective about 50 times. Effective, effectively, effectiveness. Yeah. It doesn't talk about benchmarking once. It doesn't talk about peer experience once. So how the government is approaching this is important, because this is how the criminal division is going to approach it. But you also have to stand back and say, what do we really make of this document? And how, as business people, are we going to try to maximally and optimally position our company, position our businesses? Because that's really what they have to do.
Mm-hmm. And then a lot of it becomes data driven as well.
Right.
If you're going to be able to have a pulse on what's going on, you need to have the data in order to be able to support it.
Exactly. And the compliance, the guidance talks about to what extent are we going to look at the maturity of the company and the nature of it. So if you think about Wells Fargo, which had an account scandal, basically 53 people in the consumer division opened up over 2 million phony accounts and the names of real customers. And what happened was Wells Fargo's division was very numbers driven. It was basically saying to these retail salespeople, hit your numbers or hit the road. And so what would most average people do if they come to the last day or two of a sales cycle and they know that if they don't close 5 accounts in the next couple of days, they're going to get fired. And if they get fired, they're not going to make their car payment. They're probably going to miss their mortgage payment, and the kids aren't going to get braces. Right? Most people put in that environment are going to be under a lot of pressure to cheat. And what they'll do, being people, is they'll rationalize the cheating. What they'll say is this company is unreasonable. This company is driving us too hard. This company is dishonest itself, so I'm only getting back at them. And in fact, Senator Warren, when she was basically taking the CEO of Wells Fargo to the woodshed, painted these 5,300 people as basically victims driven to the breaking point by their corporate taskmasters. Mm-hmm. And within this environment, though, Wells Fargo it was a digitalized company. So whenever these people are acting, whenever they're opening up accounts, they're interacting with a computer system, which is retaining all this data. And it would have been relatively straightforward, I think, and quite simple to have created automated audit processes that are going to flag things like someone who opens up an unusually high number of accounts right before the end of a sales cycle, or someone who always opens up almost exactly this same number of accounts at the end of a sales cycle. Or people who are opening up accounts that then aren't used by the customers in whose name they've been opened. So all that could have been automated, and it could have red flagged a bunch of stuff for investigation that would have made it really impossible for this fraud to happen. And to me, that's the interesting question is, why didn't the head of the division put that in place? And the only reason I can think of, and this is my speculation, is because she didn't want to. She was happy with the story, even if the story was fiction. And then the next question is, where was the CEO and where was the board? Why weren't they asking about the controls for this division? And see, to my mind, Senator Warren, God bless her, a very, very talented, devoted public servant, was focused on a story of greed. Mm-hmm. And to me, greed doesn't get you very far because we're dealing with people. So we're going to have greed. When you focus on the controls, you end up with a much more interesting and much more powerful question and a much more telling criticism of Wells Fargo, which is not that people were greedy, it's that they basically intentionally avoided putting in place the process controls that would have deterred the fraud or caught it.